Back in the 1830s, there were two giants of American medicine up in the New England states. One was a Dr. Gallup, the other was a Dr. Tully. Gallup believed in bleeding people, and it was his theory that inflammation and fever were caused by the patient having too much blood, and so he removed the blood ounce by ounce. The temperature dropped, but too often it continued to drop, and many of those patients died, including George Washington, who begged his physicians to leave him alone and let him die in peace after they had removed at least 32 ounces of his blood. Tully believed in drugging people, and it was his theory that we should tear down the patient's body artificially by the use of strong drugs. And then, as the body is overcoming this drugging, it would automatically overcome the causes of the original sickness. He and his colleagues used calomel, opium, prussic acid, lunar caustic, antimony, arsenic, heroin, mercury, chloroform, and strychnine. By the 1860s, there were a number of health reform movements already in existence in this country, but from the very beginning, the Seventh-day Adventist approach was distinctive. It was motivated by the belief that the human body is the temple of God, and that seeking, preserving, and promoting good health is an outward expression of inward faith and Christian love. To Seventh-day Adventists and many other Christians, 1 Corinthians 6:19 and 20 is a clear directive for healthful living. What? Know you not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost which is in you, which you have of God, and you are not your own? For you were bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. You see, medieval Christians believed that it was impossible for a good Christian to be healthy. They thought the spirit was good, but the flesh was evil. Adventists said, on the contrary, God created both the body and the spirit, and they work in harmony with each other. Therefore, it's not a denial of faith to care for the body. Our pioneers observed that Jesus Christ, the great physician, spent more time healing than preaching, and believed that medical missionary work was a good way to demonstrate to others the kindness and compassion of God. So in May of 1866, the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, meeting in Battle Creek, Michigan, was persuaded that they should have their own medical institution. And they were persuaded by a remarkable Battle Creek housewife named Ellen G. White. Now, I'm talking to the public or to the Proton Support Group. I told them, if I were to tell you about the Proton Treatment Center here at Loma Linda University Medical Center, and I failed to mention to you that Dr. James M. Slater had won international awards in dosimetry and computer-assisted radiation therapy planning, I would not be giving credit where credit is due. We need to give credit where credit is due. I tell the students that I teach we would not be in this room tonight if it were not for Ellen G. White. Ellen Harmon was her maiden name. She was walking home from the third grade, we know she was 9 years of age, with her fraternal twin sister Elizabeth and a classmate. The three little girls were threatened by a 14-year-old girl who had been irritated by we don't know what. The Harmon girls had always been taught if ever they were in any kind of danger, they should run home, and so they started running home with their classmate. It was a 13-year-old girl. 13-year-old girl picked up a rock and took up the chase. And she hurled the rock at the three little girls just as Ellen turned around to see if the older girl were catching up. Well, an accident happened. The rock smashed into Ellen's face. It broke her nose. It disfigured her face, and it knocked her unconscious to the ground. She was helped to a nearby store where she bled profusely. One kind gentleman offered to take her home in his carriage, but she refused because she didn't want to soil the man's carriage. Evidently, the adults in this store didn't realize how seriously this little Methodist girl had been injured, or they would have insisted on taking her home. Instead, she collapsed again shortly after leaving the store. Her sister and classmate had to carry her almost all of the way home, where she lay for several weeks, semi-comatose, in a large cradle that was prepared for her. Her father returned from a trip to Atlanta, Georgia, 2 months after the incident, and didn't even recognize his own daughter because her face had been so badly disfigured in this incident. She went back to school, but she was unable to learn. I suppose today we would say that she suffered a learning handicap. She tried again when she was 12 years of age, and she couldn't take the pressure. So she dropped out of school with less than 3 years of formal education. It seemed impossible for me to study and retain what I learned, she later wrote. My nervous system was prostrated and my hand trembled, so that I made but little progress in writing and could get no further than the simple copies in coarse hand. Ellen White was her married name. She died in 1915 at the age of 87. She had said, I could get no further than the simple copies in coarse hand. Yet this remarkable woman, with this meager educational background, went on to write more serious books that have been published in more languages, that have wider distribution than has any other woman in history. She wrote in areas that she had absolutely no formal education and very little experience. She wrote in the field of education, the foundation for the world's largest Protestant educational system. Today, there are 1.7 million students in this educational system. An interesting story can be told about her writings in education. The Minister of Education for Serbia came to the United States for advanced study in education. He attended Columbia University, and while he was here, he was expected to write a book on education for Serbia. This man was already a well-educated gentleman. He had 1 master's degree and 2 doctorates. One of them was in education. When he returned home, he had his book. He was expected to write his book on education for Serbia. His book was lauded by his countrymen as a masterpiece. It bears the stamp of approval of the local Orthodox Church. Ironically, his book, published in 1912, is a word-for-word translation of Ellen White's book Education, published in 1903. Interesting. Evidently, there was a lot of literary borrowing that was going on in those days, and we recognize that. But we think this is especially interesting when you consider the educational background of the 2 authors and the subject of the book. She wrote in the field of medicine when patients were being bled to death and drugged to death. She argued for rational methods of therapy which were completely against the medical practices of her day. Good nutrition, rest, exercise, sunshine, proper use of water, fresh air, abstinence from alcohol and tobacco, and trust in divine power. She called tobacco a poison of the most deceitful and malignant kind in 1864, exactly 100 years before the famous United States Surgeon General's report entitled Smoking and Health of 1964. She said that alcohol damages the brain. Did you know that it's only been since the early 1970s that we have had the term fetal alcohol syndrome, which causes both physical and mental retardation and is 100% preventable? That's just one example of how alcohol damages the brain. She said there was electricity inside the human body. She talked about electrical currents before there were such things as electrocardiograms, vectorcardiograms, electroencephalograms, and electromyograms. In making a point in the field of nutrition in 1901, she said, "The whys and wherefores of this I know not, but I give you the instruction as it is given me." Now, what was she talking about? I looked it up. She was talking about the intake of salt. What would she say about that? The health reformers were saying all kinds of things. Nobody said what she said. In fact, one of the health reformers said, salt, being a mineral poison, should never be eaten. She said, our bodies need salt, but she said we need to take it very sparingly. Ellen White's position was confirmed in the January 1977 Senate Select Committee Report on Nutrition and Human Needs, entitled Dietary Goals for the United States, the first time the United States government had issued such a report. Now, Ellen White never called herself a prophet. She never held a church office. We do not worship Ellen White, nor do we consider her writings to be more important than Scripture. She called herself a messenger. It's very meaningful to us that she was a humble, compassionate Christian woman, and her main goal in life was the uplifting of humanity by the uplifting of Jesus Christ. So we opened the doors of the Western Health Reform Institute on the edges of Battle Creek, Michigan, on September 5, 1866, with 2 physicians, 2 bath attendants, 1 untrained nurse, 3 or 4 helpers, that's what they call the other employees, and 1 patient. Today, the medical work of the church reaches into 65 countries. It employs 112,000 people in more than 500 medical institutions. Now, they're not all hospitals. Some of them are orphanages. About 100 of them, more than 100 of them, are dental clinics. Of the hospitals, the one we have here at Loma Linda University Medical Center is the flagship. Within 10 years, the Health Reform Institute was renamed the Battle Creek Sanitarium by Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. In so doing, Dr. Kellogg coined the word sanitarium, a word that had great medical significance, in the year 1877. This was the same year that Joseph Lister, having experimented with antiseptic surgery, was appointed chief surgeon at King's College near London. He was surgeon to Queen Victoria. This was the same year that Louis Pasteur presented his germ theory to the French Academy of Sciences. And so this new word sanitarium told people around the world that the physicians at Battle Creek accepted Pasteur's germ theory and were doing something about it. He had invested the word with the concept of sanitation. Famous guests and patients of the Battle Creek Sanitarium included Henry Ford, James Buick, Harvey Firestone, J.C. Penney, Montgomery Ward, S.S. Kresge, that's Kmart today. It looks like a who's who in American history. World champion swimmer Johnny Weissmuller, Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, founder of the Red Cross Clara Barton. By the year 1900, the Seventh-day Adventist Church had started 27 sanitariums and treatment rooms around the world and had an excellent reputation. In 1904 and 1905, we started 3 more sanitariums in Southern California. One in Paradise Valley near San Diego, one in Glendale, and one here in Loma Linda. Now, somebody has calculated that Ellen White had approximately 2,000 really unusual experiences. When I'm talking to the public, I tell them they were dream-like experiences, but they were so vivid to her that she was able to write down what she saw and share this with church leaders. I believe the first time she saw Loma Linda in this special way was on October 10, 1901, and I'll come back to this later. She had another one of these dream-like experiences in the fall of 1902, and following that, she wrote to church leaders and she said that we as a denomination would be able to purchase unoccupied properties in Southern California that could be used as sanitariums, and we would pay much less than their original cost. The Paradise Valley facility represented an investment of $25,000. It was offered to us for $12,000, and eventually we bought that for $4,000. The Glendale Hotel, now Glendale Adventist Medical Center, represented an investment of $50,000. I saw one figure as high as $65,000. Was offered to us for $26,000 and eventually purchased for $12,000. She urged a young Adventist minister named John Burden to come to the area between Riverside, San Bernardino, and Redlands to look for this property that she had seen. She said it's closer to Redlands than it is to Riverside, and she had never been here. When Burden arrived, he found a place called Loma Linda. It had been built by land speculators back in the 1880s, and it represented an investment of $155,000. The caretakers were authorized to move it for $110,000. Well, that was completely out of the question, and Burden left. Mrs. White urged Burden to return. This time they dropped their price to $85,000. Well, that was like $85 million to our church members. We only had 1,400 in all of Southern California. They were helping to pay for their own 22 churches, and these other two sanitariums. And our General Conference in Washington, D.C. had just established a no-debt policy and couldn't help. One of my historian predecessors, Dr. Kell Reynolds, called her an intrepid little woman in a black bonnet who coaxed and prodded the reluctant men of the cloth into purchasing this hill we call Loma Linda back in 1905 when there was no money in sight. Under these circumstances, the intrepid little woman in a black bonnet urged Burden to return. This time they dropped their price to $45,000. Burden asked them, if you're really serious in selling Loma Linda, what would be your bottom dollar? And they said, we'll settle for $40,000. The terms of the deal were $5,000 down, 3 monthly payments of $5,000. That was the first half of it. And the remaining $20,000 at the end of 3 years. People came here to sign the papers on Friday, May 26, 1905. As the day wore on, and as the Sabbath approached, they decided to postpone the signing of the papers until the following Monday. On the intervening Sunday, Burden received a telegram from George W. Reeser, the brand new president of the Southern California Conference. He had just been appointed into that position at the 1905 General Conference session in Washington, D.C. And his telegram said, developments here warrant advising, do not make deposit on sanitarium. Whoa, what is Pastor Burden supposed to do under these circumstances? He's a Christian gentleman. He's made a deal. It's a good deal. It's been approved by the messenger, and his new boss tells him to kill it. Monday morning came. Burden went ahead, put $1,000 down to secure an option to buy Loma Linda. He signed, taking personal responsibility for it. This was his. He did not commit the denomination. He did not commit insubordination. And it's under these circumstances that we can better understand the kind of faith that marked Pastor Burden and those who rallied behind him in the purchase and development of Loma Linda. Before another dollar was spent, Mrs. White arrived here in Loma Linda with her son Willie. They detrained at Redlands Junction, which is the Bryn Mawr section of Loma Linda. They came in on a horse-drawn express wagon. That was a wagon that was used in those days to move luggage around train depots. As she arrived, she looked at this building, the luxury hotel, and she said, I've been here before. Willie, who would know, he was her constant attendant and companion, said, no, mother, you've never been here. Then this is the place I was shown, she said, and she repeated that several times as she was taken around the property. When they got to the recreation hall on top of the hill, there were card tables, there were cards on the floor, there were billiard tables in there. There was a bowling alley on the south side of that building. And there she talked about the educational work the Seventh-day Adventist Church would someday conduct here in Loma Linda. That afternoon, in the grand parlor of the luxury hotel, she spoke on her favorite subject, the great medical missionary, and then she retired from her travels. There were about 20 brethren with her at that time, and that's what they called them in those days too. They called them the brethren. And after she left, they started a heated discussion. Now, if I were to summarize it in one sentence, these are my words. It would be, what are we doing here? On one hand, they all had a very high regard for the person they referred to as Sister White and her special gift. On the other hand, they had no money. I have in my unabridged history of Loma Linda the words, the height of folly, coming out of that meeting on June 12, 1905. That was a summary that somebody gave. They said it would be the height of folly to go forward and do what Ellen White and John Burden wanted to do. Now, it may have been even worse than they thought, because they may not have known what I'm about to tell you right now. The first group to do something here in Loma Linda was the Mound City Land and Water Company. These people were called boomers. They had boomers back in those days. They were people who built boom towns. They were encouraged by the fact that the Southern Pacific Railroad had just established a right-of-way somewhat diagonally through the property, heading for San Mateo Canyon and the East Coast. It was going to be a transcontinental railroad. They failed. They sold to a farmer named H.E. Hills. Mr. Hills plowed up Mound City, planted crops and orchards, got sick and died. But before he died, he and his wife sold to the Mound City Land and Water Company. Now, in 1887, the San Bernardino City and County Directory claimed that this area, where I'm sitting right now, because of its proximity to Colton and San Bernardino, would probably never amount to anything more than a possible way station on the Southern Pacific Railroad. Well, evidently, the Mound City Land and Water Company didn't read that, because that's the same year that they started building this luxury hotel, which they completed in 1888. Now, this looks so good from the outside that Scipio Craig, the editor of the Citrograph, which was a Redlands weekly, it was published throughout Southern California, wrote that this may someday become world famous as a health resort. They failed. This place was vacant for almost 12 years. And then the Loma Linda Association came to town. 80 physicians and 40 businessmen. They had the money and they had the talent to make this work. They're the ones who changed the name from Mound City to Loma Linda, a Spanish name literally meaning hill pretty, or as we say in English, pretty hill. They sent their business manager up to the St. Helena Sanitarium in the Napa Valley to find out, how do Seventh-day Adventists operate a successful sanitarium? We had a good reputation. He went up there and became a patient. He took notes. He bought the same equipment. He hired a steward and chef for his dining facilities. They got food from their own dairy, orchards, and gardens. One of them was a man named Lankershim. There is a Lankershim Boulevard in Los Angeles. One of them was the former president of the Los Angeles County Medical Society. One of them was the medical director of the Highlands Insane Asylum, we now call Patton State Hospital. One of them was Frank Miller, the man who turned the Glenwood Hotel in Riverside into the landmark Mission Inn. They should have been able to make it work, but they failed. There were times when they didn't even have one patient. Our people didn't even have to do a feasibility study, if such a thing were available in those days, to know for sure that what John Burden and Ellen White wanted to do wouldn't work. But there were people of faith who came up with the rest of the $5,000 down, another $4,000. So now we have invested $5,000 in this property. Well, George Reeser comes back from the General Conference session. He sees what's happening here in Southern California. And he decided to call a couple of meetings represented by almost all of his 22 churches. One of them was held in the Carr Street Seventh-day Adventist Church in Los Angeles. Ellen White was there. During that meeting, he said, according to Sister White, that's what he called her, Loma Linda should someday become our principal training school on this coast. At that instant, she interrupted him and said, "This will be." Now you may ask yourself, how does he know she said it like that? He wasn't there. I read it in a book, but it didn't tell me she said it like that. I put two things together. Number one, we know that she was capable of doing that. She was a public speaker Not only for the denomination, she was a popular speaker for the public too. She was a presenter for the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And she reportedly could speak to thousands of people at a time without the use of a public address system, something that I cannot do. Secondly, historians like to look at original documents. We call them primary sources. I contacted the Southern California Conference, and I requested a copy of the minutes to that meeting. Over on page 3, Reeser is talking. As soon as he mentions Principal Training School on this coast, it says right in the minutes that she interrupted him with those 3 little words. This will be. The only words in the entire minutes that were recorded in all capital letters and underlined. Well, finally, the conference committee of the church got behind the project. They were meeting in Los Angeles on the deadline day of the first $5,000 payment. It was July 26, 1905. They met at 10 a.m. They needed $5,000 by 2 p.m., and they didn't have $1 of it. The situation was thick with tension. There were 2 camps of people there. One group said, we need to go forward in faith. And the other group said, what do you suggest we do? We don't have any money. I wondered, why did Ellen White keep pushing under these circumstances? And it goes back to that dreamlike experience she had on October 10, 1901. Ladies and gentlemen, this is documented. She wrote in her journal, I seemed to be living there. I saw patients sitting in wheelchairs under giant shade trees that seemed to form a tent-like canopy. Glendale and Paradise Valley had no tent-like canopy of trees. That's why she kept looking for a third institution, something that would match what she had seen. Loma Linda did. But when she wrote that in her journal, Loma Linda did not match what she saw a year later as unoccupied property for sale for much less than its original cost. In fact, what I'm going to tell you now is new history. It will be published shortly in one of my history books. I found it at the A.K. Smiley Public Library in their heritage room over there, something that happened 4 years before Ellen White and John Burden even set foot in Loma Linda. 9 days after Ellen White wrote in her journal about the tent-like canopy of trees, the Loma Linda Association placed their first advertisement in the Citrograph saying, we are now opening our new healthcare institution. They weren't even close to putting it up for sale for much less than its original cost. And embedded in that advertisement was a photograph of Loma Linda with one of its 2 tent-like canopies of trees. I wondered, why did John Burden keep pushing under these circumstances? And it goes back to a letter he had received from Ellen White. She said, go ahead, money will come from unexpected sources. Someone suggested they wait for the morning mail. In the morning mail was a letter from a woman in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Her letter had been mailed weeks in advance. It had traveled completely across the continent. Nobody out here knew who that woman was, and we don't know to this day. And inside her letter was a bank draft for $5,000, the exact amount that was needed less than 4 hours later on that deadline day. They say there wasn't a dry eye in the room. That would be well over $100,000 in today's money. One of the critics came up to John Burden. He said, it seems the Lord is in this project. Burden said, yes, and he will carry it through to victory. And that's exactly what happened. Because instead of paying for this place in 3 years and 8 months, we paid for it in less than 6 months, received 2 additional discounts totaling $1,100. The original purchase price of Loma Linda was $38,900, much less than its original cost. Money from an unexpected source for unoccupied property in Southern California that had a tent-like canopy of trees. Praise God, 5 out of 5. That is statistically significant. We believe under these circumstances, miraculous. We opened the Loma Linda Sanitarium in this building in October of 1905. We started our School of Nursing the very next month in November of 1905. And I have a quotation I'd like to share with you. There, by the way, is Ellen G. White and her co-founder, John Burden. If we ever keep God's vision concerning our medical work before our eyes and flaming in our hearts, all will be well. It is a time for hearts to catch new inspiration from the glory of the vision. Percy T. McGann. If that was true in 1940, how much more true it is today. Now, this facility had 64 rooms. It was lighted with electricity. It was heated with steam. There was about a mile of concrete sidewalks. Water coming from an artesian well was piped all over the premises. And there was $12,000 to $20,000 worth of equipment that had never been used, or very little used. And there were canaries in the pepper trees. Now you notice an unusual structure on both sides. You see there's a structure that's coming out from the edge of the corner. I wondered what that was, and look what I found. At the A.K. Smiley Public Library in Redlands, it was a little sun porch. It is rumored that Ellen White used to stay in one of the rooms right above the dining room of the luxury hotel. This is what it would have looked like. Now, the Loma Linda Association purchased the property toward the end of 1900, and they refurbished the hotel. They built a recreation hall on top of the hill and the 5 cottages on the east crest. Over the sun parlor facing north, they removed 3 small gables from this roof, and they added one with their name, with some fancy woodwork around the name Loma Linda. When we raised this building in 1967, we salvaged that sign, restored it, and is now hanging over the main entrance to the Del Webb Library. So our students and our faculty and our visitors can see more than 100 years of history right here in this one sign. Now, directly under that was the sun parlor. And I have to acknowledge that I got this picture from the San Bernardino County Museum. We had pictures in our heritage room, but they didn't have people, and I like to show people whenever possible. And this is a color photograph of the inside of the luxury hotel that I got from the A.K. Smiley Public Library. On the left, about halfway down that walkway, after we were here for 2 years, Ellen White recommended that we install an elevator. And so that was installed in 1907. When we raised this building in 1967, Dr. Einar Ritchie salvaged the elevator carriage, and it is now a gazebo in front of the Ritchie Mansion down on Prospect Street. There were 119 steps that went up the north face of the hill from the train depot toward the north entrance of the Loma Linda Sanitarium. If you look closely, you can see some rounded pictures, some rounded windows up at the top. And I wondered if that was usable space. Look what I found. They're doing occupational therapy up there. Now, if we were to step to the right outside of the building and look north, we would see Pepper Drive. You can see all those pepper trees. That was one of the 2 tent-like canopies of trees. And the Loma Linda Depot is just to the right of that. Now, in 1916, in January, there were 2 major floods that took out most of the pepper trees. And so sometime after that, it was renamed Anderson Street, the main road that comes into Loma Linda. Now, back in those days, the buildings were not named, they were not numbered as we number them today, they were named. And the large cottage on the right was creatively named Large Cottage. Now this is Dr. Julia Ann White, a woman who came to us from the Battle Creek Sanitarium. She had been a student at the American Medical Missionary College that Dr. John Harvey Kellogg started in 1895. And she came here with some well-trained nurses to start our nurses training school. And here is their first class, a group of 7 people who graduated in 1907, 5 women and 2 men. And they're looking at a little patient named Edward Abbott. Richard Edward Abbott was the son of the first dean of our School of Medicine, Dr. George K. Abbott. Now this is the south side of the sanitarium, the one that we used as a main entrance. And these men are running our ambulance service, and I've sometimes wondered what they would have thought if we could have told them that someday we would have the only hospital designated by the state of California as a level 1 regional trauma center with 2 heliports and as many as 1,627 emergency helicopter flights taking their place. Now this is the first class in the School of Medicine. It had 10 students. Here's 9 of the 10 with their Bible teacher, Roderick S. Owen, at the bottom. Now the woman on the top step is the first graduate of this School of Medicine. Her name was Zoe Nightingale. She was related to the woman with the lamp, the pioneer nurse named Florence Nightingale, who was a nurse during the Crimean War. Now here's a procession coming from the recreation hall we referred to earlier, which we renamed Assembly Hall. And these people are on their way to an early service here on campus. Now this is the first School of Medicine building. It was constructed in what is now our Basic Sciences quadrangle between, those of you who are familiar with campus, between Evans Hall and Anderson Street. It was 55 feet by 65 feet, 4 stories tall. It had a chemistry laboratory and a library. This is the Alfred Shryock class in histology or microscopic anatomy. Alfred Shryock and his wife Stella on the left teaching this class. Now if you were to go out and look at those windows, you would be able to look down on the future site of Alfred Shryock Hall, which was the anatomy department here for many years. Now this is our mass transit. This was a Moore truck that was owned by the Loma Linda Sanitarium. And this picture is taking a group of students and faculty to a medical evangelistic meeting, which was part of the curriculum here. And Dr. Julia Ann White is sitting on the front bench with her hat tied on. That could take as many as 21 medical students to San Bernardino County Hospital for clinical experience. And this was our first hospital. It was located right out in the middle of our Basic Sciences quadrangle, and it was a failure. It was a 70-bed hospital with 12 to 26 patients in it. It was opened on December 1, 1913. And you can see why it was a failure, because you can look in the background. There's no homes. This was the sticks back in those days. Now, the Board of Trustees at the College of Medical Evangelists, which was the name of this institution at that time, realized that this would not be sufficient several months before this was opened. So in September of 1913, they opened what they called an outpatient dispensary in Los Angeles. And that's why the Ellen G. White Memorial Medical Center is celebrating 1913 as their beginning. They're celebrating their 100th anniversary now. Now I'm going to show you exactly where this picture was taken. Well, I was going to show you a picture of our mission globe. I don't have it here right now. But in this picture, you can see 3 classes observing a surgery. And one of the men on the back row is the grandfather of the present dean of our School of Medicine, Dr. Roger Hadley. The second School of Medicine building was built south of the School of Medicine building, and it was called South Laboratory. This was 1919. And when it was built, the School of Medicine building was renamed North Laboratory. Now, Dr. Harold Shryock, the son of the Shryoks we saw a few minutes ago, both he and his father eventually became the dean of the School of Medicine. And Dr. Shryock told me that at one time this parking lot held every automobile in Loma Linda. Now, this is the oldest structure in Loma Linda, the Southern Pacific Railroad. And this was the privately operated Loma Linda Depot. It had mileage on the sign, mileage to San Francisco and mileage to New Orleans. And I mentioned the flood, 1916, 2 floods in January. They took out the Loma Linda Depot, 200 feet of land, 8 feet deep. And it was such a traumatic experience that people in Loma Linda referred to history here as things that happened before the flood and after the flood. Across the way, in what is now known as Elmer Dignio Park, was a U-shaped building, and it was named. Its name was Dewdrop Inn, and it did. People came from miles around to see this. You'll also notice there's a water tower in the background. Many of the homes had their own water towers because water came 2, sometimes 3 times a month. Now, this is the nurses' training school posing in front of the south entrance to the Loma Linda Sanitarium. And this is the Ellen G. White Memorial Hospital in East Los Angeles that was constructed in 1918. It was a cottage hospital. And our student nurses used to rotate from the Loma Linda campus. They got clinical experience, completely different kind of clinical experience in Los Angeles. They had access to more OBGYN and surgery patients on the Los Angeles campus. Now I want to show you the building in front of us there was the outpatient dispensary after they had moved from a much smaller facility, and it was half this big to begin with. To double it in size, they raised the 1 story up in the air because it had a roof on it, and they built the 2nd story, then became the 1st story. And I want to point out a landmark. You see that stairway at the main entrance that goes up one side and down the other? Because the next picture will show you what happened in 1937 to the cottage hospital. We built the first earthquake-proof, fire-proof hospital in the city of Los Angeles. Now, on our 50th anniversary, Richard Nixon, the Vice President of the United States, took part in our 50th anniversary celebration. I don't know if you can read it, but on that plaque in the front are the words 50th anniversary, and across the top it says to make man whole. That was the theme of the 50th anniversary. And I found in our board minutes in December of the next year, 1956, where the Board of Trustees voted to make that our motto. So that's been our motto, to make man whole, since 1956. In 1924, we built the 2nd hospital, and it was up on the hill. This is the west end of what we call Nickel Hall now, but we performed surgery there. And I've sometimes wondered what these folks would have thought if we could have told them that someday this institution would be the world pioneer in infant heart transplantation. Now, the middle section of that building was started in 1928, and it was completed in 1929. Now, you notice in the sky there is nothing really but sky. In 1929, probably the end of 1928 and the first part of 29, we installed a 100,000 gallon water tower. Now, if you were to go in the main entrance there, right under that rotunda, and turn left or north, you would be able to see the grand parlor. Now, that beautiful table we have there is now located in the Heritage Research Center at Loma Linda University. Going in the opposite direction was the patient dining room. And if you look at this, the wing that's coming toward us was the parlor. The wing going in the opposite direction in the middle was the dining room, and to the right of that was the kitchen. The first section on the far right was 1924. The T, it looks like a T section. The middle section was 1929, and the wing on the far left was built in 1949. To build that, we had to remove Southwest Cottage and Large Cottage. That eventually became a 189-bed community hospital. Also in 1924, we built an outdoor amphitheater on the north slope of the hill. Here you can see a graduation class for the School of Nursing, and the guest speaker for that graduation class was a man many of you will remember, named HMS Richards. And you see there was no orchestra pit. The orchestra sat in front of the raised stage. But in 1935, we built an acoustical shell with an orchestra pit. And from then on, it was known as the Loma Linda Bowl. Looks a little bit like the Hollywood Bowl, although it may have even predated the Hollywood Bowl. Here's a class of physicians graduating in the Loma Linda Bowl. Within 2 years, it was doubled in size. It could eventually seat 1,500. In 1950, we moved to the Redlands Community Bowl, and we had our graduation ceremonies over there for a number of years. Today, we're having them in the Drayson Center and in the mall, which is in front of the University Church and the School of Dentistry, and just north of the School of Medicine and the Medical Center. In 1953, we built the library and administration building. In 1961, I don't know if you can see it, but over the breezeway it says College of Medical Evangelists. In 1961, now it says Loma Linda University. Now this is the huge Los Angeles County General Hospital, and this figures in a major way in the history of the College of Medical Evangelists. Back in the teens, the Council on Medical Education of the American Medical Association rejected the idea that a lot of schools of medicine had of teaching basic sciences out in the country as we did and providing clinical experience in a big city. We taught basic sciences here in Loma Linda and went to Los Angeles for clinical experience at the Ellen G. White Memorial Hospital and this Los Angeles County General Hospital. We weren't the only ones who did that. Excuse me. Cornell University did that. Stanford University provided basic sciences in Palo Alto and clinical experience in San Francisco. But after the 2 world wars, they really leaned on us. They said, you're duplicating your administrative offices, you're duplicating your library, your students have to relocate 60 miles right in the middle of their medical education. Besides that, we think it would be a good idea for your basic science faculty to be able to relate to your clinical faculty, and they can't do that. Our problem was, what are we going to do? Are we going to move everything to Los Angeles, or are we going to move everything to Loma Linda? Somebody in our board minutes reported that it was a polite ultimatum. Our basic sciences faculty in Loma Linda absolutely refused to go to Los Angeles. They were considered to be stubborn. The people who supported them said, if you consolidate in Los Angeles, you will alienate the church constituency, and it would be a major violation of the counsels of Ellen G. White. On the other hand, the volunteer clinical faculty in Los Angeles said, if you move it to Loma Linda, you'll kill it. The School of Medicine's accreditation will not survive out there because there still are not enough potential patients for a school of medicine this size. So what to do? The Board of Trustees asked the administration here to consult with the American Medical Association. The AMA sent 4 deans of 4 major schools of medicine in America to California to consult with us. They first came to Loma Linda, and then they went to Los Angeles. And when they saw this, it was all over. Because of the importance of clinical experience in medical education, they were forced to recommend that we consolidate the School of Medicine in Los Angeles. And their recommendation carried tremendous weight because they were each connected with the accreditation process, and they would let their recommendation be known to the Council on Medical Education. So in 1961, the Board of Trustees here voted to consolidate the School of Medicine in Los Angeles. But before that decision was implemented, they reversed themselves, and the writings of Ellen G. White played a major role in that decision. I found the decision in our board minutes on September 25, 1962. It's quite lengthy and a little fuzzy. If you read it carefully, you can see that we're going to consolidate the School of Medicine in Loma Linda, but it talks a lot about the White, what we're going to do there. We're going to enlarge it, add new beds, build a new surgery suite. So I was amazed the next day to a second vote on September 26, 1962. Some of the trustees felt that it would be well to declare in emphatic form, re-emphasizing the decision to develop the School of Medicine on the Loma Linda campus. Here it is, folks, in one long sentence. Voted that the 4-year program of the School of Medicine be developed on the Loma Linda campus of the Loma Linda University, in effect continuing the teaching of the basic sciences on that campus and transferring to the Loma Linda campus the junior and senior classes as soon as clinical facilities can be made available. Anybody can misunderstand that. We had groundbreaking ceremonies for Loma Linda University Hospital. That was its name at that time, on commencement weekend of 1964. This was the largest project ever undertaken by the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. The $20 million was borrowed through the General Conference, not from the General Conference. It was paid back with interest within 20 years. As many as 600 to 700 workmen fast-track built that university hospital in less than 3 years. During the construction, Dr. David B. Hinshaw, the Dean of the School of Medicine, became convinced that a 320-bed hospital would not be large enough. So he talked the Board of Trustees into adding 2 more stories to the 3 circular 7-story towers. Now here you can see a postcard, a watercolor postcard that we had from that time. The towers don't look quite right, do they? They're 5 stories tall. This is what it looked like when they were finished, and took us up to 516 beds. Here we have the grand opening tours on commencement weekend of 1967. On the left, Godfrey T. Anderson, the president of Loma Linda University. Next to him is Maynard V. Campbell, the chairman of the Board of Trustees. Next is yours truly, and to the right of the picture, you can see Dr. Hinshaw's mustache and Robert Cohn, the vice president for finance. On July 9, 1967, we moved 125 patients with the help of the United States Army Reserves from the old hospital on the hill into the new university hospital. Everybody participated. This was a moving van that we rented to move patients who were bedridden. Here you can see some cribs. And the lady on the left was Ruth Monroe, the assistant dean of the School of Nursing. Everybody participated. On the right is Loma Linda's first pediatrics resident. Her name was Dr. Lynn Behrens. When I took this picture of Dr. Behrens, I had no idea that she would someday become the dean of the School of Medicine and later the president of almost everything in Loma Linda. And little did she know that there was a young man who was helping to move patients that day, a student physician named Richard Hart, who eventually became the dean of the School of Public Health in that old hospital, and today the president of almost everything in Loma Linda. We left the top 2 levels of the 3 towers temporarily vacant. We finished one level of one tower at a time until the facility was completed in 1970, and in September that year we renamed it Loma Linda University Medical Center. Now, we had received some criticism for building this big white elephant out in the middle of the orange grove where we were going to rattle around. To give you some perspective, we needed more office space around the hospital on the hill, and that was done with mobile offices, trailers. I remember the chaplains were in one of the trailers. Within 3 years, we had this building finished, renamed it, and we added 17 trailers at the end of the research wing. Those temporary trailers lasted for 25 years. Now, if you look to the right of the medical center, which would be south, you will see that we have enlarged this facility. I'm going to guess at least 1,000%, with the Children's Hospital, the Proton Treatment Center. The School of Nursing was moved out of that facility across the street to West Hall. We have now the outpatient doctor's offices called the faculty medical offices, and the outpatient surgery center, the professional plaza down Barton Road, the East Campus Hospital, and it has just been enlarged. This is an enlargement of it. The Rehabilitation Institute, the Behavioral Medicine Center in West Redlands, the Behavioral Institute, brand new building, about 3 years old now, and the Heart and Surgical Hospital, 28 beds, will be going eventually to 88 beds. The Centennial Complex, and in Beaumont, the Highland Springs Medical Plaza was a partnership with Redlands Community Hospital, our doctors, Loma Linda doctors, and then the Loma Linda University Medical Center, Murrieta. This hospital is 106 beds, eventually could go up to 250 beds. And what happened here, we did a feasibility study, realizing that our facilities here were maxed out. We needed to do more outreach, so we developed a hub and spoke model. So the Highland Springs Medical Plaza was the first spoke. This is the second spoke. And we discovered that the Murrieta Temecula area was underserved. They had 2 hospitals, but half of the population were leaving. We found that there was a group of physicians out there who were going to build their own hospital. It was going to be a for-profit hospital, and its name was going to be Physicians Hospital Murrieta. We contacted them with the idea of doing a joint venture. They liked the idea. Their vendors liked the idea. And so it became a joint venture. Now, during the construction, or before it was open, just before it was open, the United States government came out with a new law that said that physicians cannot refer patients to themselves. And so we bought them out. That's all Loma Linda now. And this is the outpatient facility that is connected with that. When it came time to name the facility, our marketing people did focus groups in the area, and those people insisted that it be named Loma Linda University Medical Center, Marietta. We had grand opening tours on Super Bowl Sunday. We expected 2,000 people to tour the facility. 10,000 people showed up. It gives you an idea of the reputation of Loma Linda University Medical Center. And this is where we have a campus transformation that is ongoing right now. It will be finished in 2020. We'll be constructing a new university hospital. In 1951, our Board of Trustees voted to start a school of dentistry. In 1953, they started their curriculum. In 1955, they opened the School of Dentistry building. In 1976, the building was doubled in size with this 5-story tower. It now has 262 dental chairs, and it has 4 claims to fame. One is the Jorgensen technique of dental pain control has put this School of Dentistry on the international map and years ahead of its sister schools of dentistry. Secondly, is the world's first postgraduate program in implant dentistry and one of the largest. It is today's go-to place for dental materials. And fourthly, it turns out really good dentists. I'd like to show you our worship facilities. This was the parlor of the luxury hotel where the first Seventh-day Adventist Church was organized in Loma Linda in January of 1906. It was small, so they soon outgrew this and they moved to that recreation hall, which again we renamed Assembly Hall. And they outgrew that. And so they started planning in 1909 to build the chapel, which was completed in 1910. It sat, here you can see its proximity to the sanitarium was kind of kitty corner. And at the bottom of the picture, that is right over the stairway now that goes down into the main entrance of the women's dormitory, Kate Lindsay Hall. And the first structure that we built was the hydrotherapy building on the far right in that picture. In other words, the facility that we purchased in 1905 was just the luxury hotel, did not include that building. Okay, it sat 750 people, and we have that pulpit in our Heritage Research Center. In 1928, the congregation had grown so much they decided to divide it into a college church and a community church. So the chapel remained the community church, and the college church moved into the first hospital, which is straight ahead in this picture. Remember, that was a hospital that was opened in December of 1913. In 1924, it was vacated, so they moved the hospital up on the hill, and this then became a men's residence. And the men's residence also had a chapel, and so that chapel became the first home of the college church. Then in 1934, they built John Burden Hall. Now, this was never a dedicated church. It was always used for educational purposes and Saturday night entertainment, and the bottom floor was the college library. On our Los Angeles campus, the David Paulson Hall was used on the same basis. 1938, New Year's Day, was the first Sabbath sermon preached in what we now call the Campus Hill Church. Now, this is one of the most unusual construction projects on campus. This was a slip form, started on the ground early one Monday morning. Men tied steel, poured concrete 24 hours a day until they got up to the top, and they have the tower for the college church. And that was known as the college church for about 1 year. When the College of Medical Evangelists became Loma Linda University, it was renamed the University Church. It sat 2,250 people. A few years ago, it underwent a makeover. Part of it was enlarged. The entrance was rebuilt. And this is what it looks like today. When I took this picture recently, I thought of Ellen White's first visit to the chapel. Remember, it was planned within 4 years of the 35 people moving onto the hill, and 5 years after that. In other words, it was opened in 1910, and when she went in there, she said, "This is all very nice, but it's too small." And then she added, "You people have no idea what this place will become if you are faithful." Today we have the largest Seventh-day Adventist congregation in North America with well over 6,000 members. On the stage you can see a musical group. We have an adult choir, a children's choir, an adult bell choir, a children's bell choir, a brass ensemble, and a television ministry which goes by satellite and internet around the world. Now remember, one of the 8 natural remedies was exercise. In the summer of 1912, our student physicians approached our board of trustees and they said, "It's just too hot. Can we use the irrigation reservoir for a swimming pool?" It was 400 feet long, 30 or 40 feet wide. I think it was 3.5 feet deep. And they were given permission not only to use it, but to sell tickets in the community. Now in 1920, this was our first swimming pool, real swimming pool on campus. And it was built just behind the recreation hall. And this was funded and constructed by student physicians. Now the next picture will show you the same swimming pool, only it doesn't look like this. And I'm going to point out some landmarks, but it will show you where that recreation hall was built in comparison to the Loma Linda Sanitarium. You notice the edge there is about 4 inches tall, and you can notice there are some sections, and you can see where the ladder is. Okay, the next picture will be the same swimming pool, and you can see where the Loma Linda Sanitarium was built right around that swimming pool, and that the recreation hall was built about 70 feet west of the rotunda of what we now call Nickel Hall. Now we have the Drayson Center. There's an indoor 1/9 mile running track, $17.6 million facility donated to us. We own the land. It has an aquatic park, and in the background, a super field. I'd like to share with you some of the major contributions to world medicine, which have come from Loma Linda University or from our alumni. This is Dr. J. Wayne McFarland, the co-author of the 5-day plan to stop smoking. This has helped more than 20 million people around the world, including inside of China. This is Dr. Edward Hahn, class of 1950. Dr. Hahn was an electronics engineer before he became a physician. Eventually became a full professor at Yale University. He is known as the world pioneer in the monitoring of fetal heart rate. Using this equipment, Loma Linda University Medical Center became the first hospital in the world to routinely monitor deliveries. Now, fetal monitoring has become a part of good obstetrical care in hospitals and clinics around the world. Dr. Melvin Judkins, class of 1947, developed the Judkins technique of computer-assisted percutaneous transfemoral selective coronary arteriography, which is used by virtually 100% of the people in the world performing coronary angiograms. This is the X-ray evaluation of the blood vessels of the heart. Dr. Judkins could have become extremely wealthy by just getting patents on his heart catheters, but he gave this to medical science. Then in 1984, we dealt with all of the wire services, broadcast networks, news magazines, people from Europe we'd never heard of before. Remember, Stern magazine was one of them out of Germany. all because of this young man. And you can see from the number of microphones in front of Dr. Leonard Bailey's face, there's quite a bit of interest in what he has to say about his little patient, baby Faye. Now, after baby Faye died, a year went by, and Dr. Bailey started the world's first successful infant-to-infant heart transplant program. He invited me to be present. I asked him if I could bring my camera. He said, okay, you'll be the only one there with a camera. So here you can see a historical picture. On the far right is Dr. David B. Hinshaw, Dr. Bailey's dean. He invited Dr. Hinshaw to be there too. Dean Hinshaw was the chairman of the Department of Surgery. Here is Hugh Downs from ABC 2020, did a double segment on our infant heart transplant program. This is baby Paul Holk, the youngest person in the world to undergo any organ transplantation of any kind. He was only 3 hours of age when he went to transplant. The NBC television network made a television movie of the week. It's the most emotional television movie I have ever seen. At the end of it, he played himself, looking like this. And in January of 1987, we transplanted our first baby girl. Her name was Baby Eve. That was a fictitious name chosen by her mother because she was the first girl. She grew up in Qatar. She came back annually for physical examination. Our audiovisual service took this picture of her when she was 6 or 7. Back around 2001, we had a birthday party in the medical center. I was invited to go there. One of my retired employees met me there, and she said, "Did you see Baby Eve?" I mean, she has a real name. I just can't remember it. We just all refer to her as Baby Eve. I said, "No, is she here?" "Yes, where is she?" "Over there by the blackboard." I looked over there, and I just about lost my composure. This young woman would not be with us today if Dr. Bailey had not had a passion for saving doomed babies. She was on a rose parade in January, on a float in the Rose Parade in January of 2013, and she recently gave birth to her own son. Now, we've learned 3 really interesting things with the infant heart transplant program. I'm sure they've learned a lot more than that, but I'm a layperson, and I think the things that I'm going to share with you are pretty impressive. We've learned that the newborn has an immature immune system and is less likely to reject the graft than is an older child or adult, especially if the transplant is done within the first 30 days of life. That was new science. That was not known before. Secondly, we've learned that the size match is not as critical as we once thought it had to be. We can transplant hearts that are a little too small or considerably too large. They come under the influence of the recipient and grow to be the right size. If they're too small, they grow faster and get bigger. If they're too large, they shrink or atrophy until they fit right in. We have transplanted the heart of a small 9-year-old into the chest of a large baby. It was so large, we couldn't close for days. But that heart shrunk in size. We were able to close and save another baby's life. And that story I just told you, plus the story I'm going to be telling you about our Proton Treatment Center, motivated the words "daring to care" on the front cover of my book, Legacy. The second thing we've learned, or the third thing, has to do with ischemic time. Now, that's the time an organ is without a blood supply. It was once thought that we had a maximum of 4 hours to transplant a human heart. And after 4 hours, there would be too much damage from lack of oxygen. Well, at the end of the 1980s, there was a dramatic increase in the number of multi-organ procurements, which means that one donor can save more than one life. But before that, we had been getting donors from Syracuse, New York, and Toronto, Canada, and from all over the United States. And there's no way that you could come to Loma Linda from the East Coast, even flying in a corporate jet, and do a transplant and do everything in 4 hours. So we've had to coordinate with other transplant centers. They would come and they would get the liver and the kidneys, other organs. We would procure the heart last. And again, there's no way that you could do that all in 4 hours. So we've had to push back the edges of science. And I've seen this happen many times since 1966, when I started working here. This time with some very simple science. We have gone incrementally from 4 hours to 5 hours to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, almost 10 and a half hours, way more than double what was thought to be the maximum amount of ischemic time. And in so doing, this institution has literally opened the state of Alaska for organ procurement. We have been all the way to Anchorage and even farther, to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and even farther, to San Juan, Puerto Rico, to save a baby's life in Loma Linda. And that says a lot about this community. The fact that on some of these cases, there have been 100 people involved, from administrators, social workers, chaplains, and registered nurses, to immunologists, ethicists, anesthesiologists, jet pilots, and transplant surgeons, all working together in a coordinated effort to try to help one little person, a stranger. We understand that the Air Traffic Controllers of America will give priority to Loma Linda's jets, because they realize that with what we're trying to do, time is of the essence. On the far left, directly under the Loma Linda University Children's Hospital, is the world's first hospital-based proton treatment center. Here's a model. This was the only one of its kind in the world for more than 10 years. Now, in 2013, there are 10 more, and another 10 under construction. I believe they're all standing on Loma Linda's shoulders. We showed that it could be done. It has 3 circular rotating gantries. They look like little Ferris wheels. They each weigh 90 tons each. When this was opened in October of 1990, it was the only one of its kind in the world in 4 different ways. The only one that was built in a hospital setting to treat cancer and other diseases. I say other diseases because we have treated wet macular degeneration in the past. We're not doing that now because ophthalmologists have a new way of doing that with injections. We treat blood vessel malformations in the brain. We're now treating cancer in more than 50 sites. Secondly, the only proton accelerator in the world being used to treat cancer, and that is a qualifying phrase because there are much larger machines out there used for research, that had enough energy to reach deep targets. I use the word target instead of tumor because a tumor is always a target, but a target is not always a tumor. A prostate gland, for example, is a target that is not a tumor. 250 million electron volts will penetrate almost 15 inches. Thirdly, the only proton accelerator in the world with continuously variable energy, which is a significant improvement over what was being done in the physics research laboratories. Some of the proton accelerators today are using synchrotrons. They have one energy. They're using cyclotrons. They have to degrade the beam to get continuously variable energy. They can do that. It's just another way of doing it. And lastly, the only proton accelerator in the world with what we call isocentric rotating gantries. They aim their beam at an isocenter, which is where the axle would be if it were a real patient. So we immobilize the patient by gravity, position the patient with laser beams and x-rays for precision treatments. Then we hit that target with continuously variable energy, usually from 2 different angles. Here you can see a little man in the bottom to give you some idea of the size of those rotating gantries. This is the synchrotron, the world's smallest synchrotron at the time. It was built by the most powerful synchrotron in the world at the time, Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory in Batavia, Illinois, just out of Chicago. It's 4 miles in circumference. Now, if you'll pretend with me that the plaque at the bottom of that is at 6 o'clock, and that's a clock face, you can see a straight device coming in from 1 o'clock to 5 o'clock. That is the injector. At the far end of the injector is the ion source, and that's where we separate the electrons from the protons of hydrogen gas. We charge the electrons with 32,000 electron volts and put them into the next, it's a kind of a straight silver-looking device that's called a radio frequency quadrupole. It's a small linear accelerator is what it is. That not only groups the protons into 425 million bunches per second, but it accelerates them from 32,000 to 2 million electron volts. Then the protons go through 6 focusing magnets. Because charged particles tend to push away from each other, that keeps them in focus. Then it goes around the 180-degree injection dipole, down into the ring of magnets about 3 o'clock, where they circulate counterclockwise inside of a vacuum tube. At 9 o'clock, you can see there's a copper acceleration cavity. That's where they get a radio frequency boost every time they come around in synchronization. And that's why it's called a synchrotron. And there they get boosted from 2 million up to 250 million electron volts. Now those protons are going around that circle up to 10 million times a second, more than 400 million miles per hour, sometimes called fast protons. They go down that hallway to the right to the switchyard. This is what the synchrotron looked like when it was at Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory, operated by the United States Department of Energy. It was disassembled and trucked to Loma Linda, and it's behind these flashing lights now. This is what it looks like in Loma Linda. There's the ion source. Its official name is a duoplasmatron. To the right of that is the radio frequency quadrupole. To the right of that are 3 of the 6 focusing magnets. There's the acceleration cavity, and there are the extraction magnets that pull the beam off of the ring. They go down that hallway. This is what the switchyard looks like on the model, and this is what it really looks like. There are 2 beams in the HBL. They call it HBL, stands for horizontal beam lines. The beam line on the left is used to treat ocular melanoma, and almost always fatal cancer of the eye. Our first patient sat in that chair in October of 1990. She received 100 million electron volts to her eye and did not feel it. To the right is another beam line that goes to a table that treats other head and neck targets along the spinal cord and prostate. The difference is here we're moving the patient around the beam. With the gantries, we're moving the beam around the patient. The outcome is the same. This is the master control. Every treatment room has its own control room, and each of the control rooms is in contact with the master control. This was on the east wall. Underwent a major upgrade in 2005. It's now all on the north wall and some on the west wall. These are the turning magnets. This is a corkscrew. They're coming in and actually going through a corkscrew about 260 degrees to come out at the patient at right angles. These are all the power supplies and cooling hoses on the far left. They go down into a pit. As the gantry turns in one direction, they roll up on a giant spool when it turns the other direction. I'm going to show you why we're excited about this. This is a real CT scan through a real prostate gland with a computer simulation of an X-ray beam. We're going to compare this with a proton beam shortly. You can see, according to the scale on the left, we're depositing 100% radiation just below the surface of the skin. It weakens to about 65 or 70% on the prostate, and down to 40% as it leaves the patient. Now, if we give the patient 2 beams, he gets twice as much radiation. The target only gets another 5 to 10%. That's why people doing this with X-rays will come in with at least 4 beams, and now even more with that, with intensity modulated radiation therapy. But here you can see we've got a square 100% around that round prostate, and we've got almost 70% going off in 4 directions. That is what causes the negative side effects we call morbidity. It's the damage that's been done to the good tissues. Now, protons, I'm going to back it up. Unlike X-rays, gamma rays, and neutrons that go completely through a patient and damage everything, protons are heavy, safe, fast, energetic, stable, subatomic, positively charged subatomic, positive charge with mass. And they stop at a point called the Bragg peak. And here you can see it. There's no measurable damage to the good tissue behind the target. Now you can see that 70% up there coming in from one beam is not acceptable. Look what happens with two beams. We can now aim and control by using computerized tomography, magnetic resonance imaging, positron emission tomography, and SPECT scanning. We can now aim and confirm an invisible beam on an invisible target with sub-millimeter precision. And that's why people are coming to Loma Linda from around the world for proton therapy. One of them came from the world's largest proton accelerator, now 17 miles in circumference, a place called CERN, just outside of Geneva, Switzerland. Dr. George Sharpak came to Loma Linda for proton therapy with the 1992 Nobel Prize in physics. This is all about physics, by the way. According to physicists, this is a no-brainer when they have prostate cancer. All started by Dr. James Slater, class of 1963. Dr. Slater had a background in physics. When it came time for him to choose a residency, he chose radiology because it uses physics. During his radiology residency in Los Angeles, follow-up work in Utah and Texas, he became extremely upset at the damage that was being done to his patients by the X-rays that were designed to help them and the lack of cure in too many cases. So during Dr. Slater's residency, he started developing beam shaping devices and patient immobilization systems to try to reduce the amount of damage that was being done to surrounding tissues. In addition to that, he thought of some other outcome, some other ways to improve outcome. He said we need to determine a way to visualize the dose distribution inside of the patient's body, and we need to determine which would be the best subatomic particle to use instead of X-rays. So when he returned to Loma Linda in 1970, Dr. Slater had a reputation, and he was charged with starting a world-class department of radiation medicine, which is what we have today. A few years ago, our Board of Trustees had such a high regard for Dr. Slater and the benefits of the Proton Treatment Center that they named the facility after him, the James M. Slater, MD Proton Treatment and Research Center. Here's Dr. Slater with Dr. Behrens and our Senator Barbara Boxer standing in front of one of the rotating gantries. Here's Dr. Slater with his very first patient, the woman who had ocular melanoma, just before she received her first treatment. Here she's being outfitted with a face mask and a bite block. So we're really serious about immobilizing that part of the body. Here's a movie star named Pierce Brosnan. One of his relatives had died from cancer. He was invited to speak here to a group, a support group, and I was asked to show him around. He's looking at the mask. I need to identify these people. This is a really, really significant picture. The man on the far left is Phil Livedall. Phil Livedall was the deputy director of Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory. He helped to design our synchrotron. Phil Livedall spent his entire career in high-energy physics research. It came to benefit him here at Loma Linda. He became our first proton patient to first prostate cancer patient to receive only protons. Next is Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis was our congressman at the time. He has brought literally hundreds of millions of dollars into this institution from the United States Congress, from the United States Department of Energy, and from the United States Department of Defense. The next man in the middle is Robert Wilson. Dr. Wilson wrote a paper that was published in 1946, published in Radiology, a medical journal. It was the first scientific paper written on the potential use of treating cancer with protons. It was entitled The Radiological Use of Fast Protons. So you see, the scientific community has known about this since 1946. But we didn't have the imaging capabilities or the computer power to use the protons with their precision until we got computerized tomography, magnetic resonance imaging, positron emission tomography, SPECT scanning, some of the sophisticated ways that we can look into the body now. And even then, it wouldn't have worked without Dr. Slater's computer-assisted radiation therapy planning. Major contribution to world medicine. When he showed this to a national meeting here in America, a woman from England, London, England, stood up in the back of the room and she said, "This is the missing link in radiation medicine." Dr. Slater spoke to NATO. He spoke to physics research laboratories around the world, including 2 of them in Russia. This is another major contribution to world medicine. And like Dr. Judkins, his first boss, he gave away his patent. He got patents on his system, but he never charged anyone to use it. He wanted to encourage as many people because this was a benefit for mankind. The man on the far right is the longest serving director of NASA, and I'll think of his name shortly. In December of 1994, I accompanied Medical Center Administration to NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C. And there we signed a 5-year memorandum of agreement for NASA to use our proton synchrotron to improve the safety of the International Space Station and future space flight. His name was Daniel Golden. And here you can see the NASA Research Center at Loma Linda University Medical Center. They have about 12,000 square feet, that's a guess. NASA scientists are coming in and out of Loma Linda routinely. And here's Daniel Golden. He said 3 really profound things. Number 1, he said this is the ultimate in technology transfer. And the reason he said that is because Loma Linda transferred the technology into the high energy physics research laboratories of the world. Now we can learn from NASA what they do in space. NASA can learn from us what we do in patient care. We get NASA's preprints and reprints. They can be involved in teaching student physicians in our School of Medicine. Some of our residents have spent time in the NASA Research Center on campus, and they can get academic credit from Loma Linda University. Thus, the ultimate in technology transfer. The second thing he said, this is the only place on Earth where NASA can do everything it needs to do on one of its major projects, and I understand that has changed. That since he said that, it has changed, but that's what he said. Which leads to the third really profound thing. He said, Loma Linda is NASA's gateway to Mars. I heard him say that. Now, the reason he said that was because the greatest long-term danger for astronauts is exposure to charged particles in space. Most of them are protons. They come from solar flares, which they call solar particle events. And they're unpredictable. So NASA used to fly space shuttles trying as much as possible to avoid solar flares. They're still involved with the International Space Station. They still want to fly to Mars. And there's no way they can avoid solar flares. So NASA has come to Loma Linda to try to determine how to protect its astronauts and their electronics from charged particles in space. Thus, Loma Linda is NASA's gateway to Mars. Now, this is what the gantry looked like that was opened. It's 12 feet across, that was opened in 1991. We didn't use the first gantry until 1991. And that's 12 feet across. We got 2 years of experience before we opened up gantries 2 and 3. This had to be done in a very scientific and conservative way. our doctors were told that we could ruin proton therapy in the world here in Loma Linda if we didn't do this right. Now, after doing that, after doing that for 2 years, we opened up gantries 2 and 3. And now, for the past 3 years, we've been using gantry 1 that was outfitted with a positioning robot. This was one of the major upgrades this facility has gone through over the years. This is now 12 feet across. Instead of 1 digital imager, it has 2. These digital imagers are talking to a computer, which is talking to the positioning robot, and they can position a patient with repeatable precision day after day in half the time. When this gets installed throughout, we eventually could increase our patient load from as many as 150 patients a day to 300. Now, since 1990, this has been the only hospital, since 1980, this has been the only hospital designated by the state of California as a level 1 regional trauma center for the 4 inland counties. That makes this the highest level of care available to patients in more than 1/4 of the California landmass. We have one of the largest neonatal intensive care units in the world. This one is now licensed for 84 beds. We have 2 emergency heliports here in Loma Linda, 1 in Murrieta now. There's the California Highway Patrol, the United States military, the Sheriff's Aviation Division, and the commercial air ambulances. Routinely more than 1,000 emergency helicopter landings every year. Now, during our graduation ceremonies of 2011, we graduated our 10,000th physician. The dean asked me to find out how that compared with the other schools. And what I learned was that it is 2,000, in excess of 2,000, more than any other school of medicine in the western United States. This is Dr. Riker Schultz, and this was a surprise for him as well as it was a surprise for everybody in the audience. Dr. Schultz is a 3rd-generation graduate of this school of medicine. He came to medical school here specifically so that he could become a medical missionary. Now, in this picture, you can see more than 100 years of Seventh-day Adventist involvement in Loma Linda. On the left is one of our heritage cottages. If you look at the glass window, you can see it's wavy. That tells you right there it's old glass. On the far right is the east wing of what was once called the Loma Linda Sanitarium and Hospital, and in the background, the University Hospital and the Children's Hospital. Now, in closing, I want to share with you a letter that came to Dr. Percy T. McGann regarding this School of Medicine in 1916. It came from Dr. John Harvey Kellogg from the world-famous Battle Creek Sanitarium, a man who'd had personal experience with the American Medical Association. He said, "On my way home, I happened to run across one of the most prominent and influential members on the Council of Medical Education. He incidentally mentioned to me that the status of Loma Linda is up before the committee at this time. Remarks which he made more than justified me in reiterating what I said to you in my former letter, that the future of the Loma Linda Medical School is absolutely hopeless. The medical profession will not tolerate such a thing as a medical college under sectarian control. I am as certain as I am alive that the Loma Linda Sanitarium will never get any higher recognition than it gets now. If you are convinced that I am right, you would hesitate to ask poor men and women who have barely sufficient to supply themselves with the necessities of life and seldom are able to indulge in the smallest luxuries to invest their hard earnings in an enterprise that has no future. I sometimes think about the 35 men and women who moved onto this hill toward the end of 1905, men and women who volunteered their time, ate out of the institution's garden until the place could earn a little profit to pay their meager salaries of $12 to $20 a week so that we could be here today to help the School of Medicine celebrate its 100th anniversary, so that we could be here today to continue the teaching and healing ministry of Jesus Christ to make man whole.